Okay, let's get going. Um, welcome, welcome to Addiction, Alcoholism, and Three Principles podcast series. Greg's has a few technical problems, so I'm just going to do what I usually do, which is fill in the space. Um, and we have as our host or our guest Jack Pransky, and I've asked Jack to come on this show to give sort of a historical evolution of the three principles and as how it applied to addiction. But we want to see how the show evolved or the three principles evolved in becoming what it is now. And we documented a little bit about Salt Spring and so on. And then Dr. Roger Mills came to Salt Spring. He was the first one. And from him, he and Elsie took it out to the universities, and then the psychologists and the helping profession started to come to the island and learn from Sid. And at that particular point, I did not join that. I did not like psychology, and I went into the indigenous world, and all the other people went into the world of psychology. And after that, George came in, and people like Jack, and Sid gave them specific trainings, which basically has formed the root of what is being presented now is these people who have been trained by Sydney Banks and has a message. I would call it more like a psychological spiritual message, where I like spiritual psychological message, but it's still, it's what's being taught out there. And in the old days, there was one, Dr. Roger Mills was really, in my mind, the best qualified teacher. He really understood how to create curriculum. And he worked, his approach was called health realization. And George's approach was called psychology of mind. And so George went out to the commercial success white crowd. I'm going to use that as just a quote thing. And Roger worked in the community development, and he created, or was part of, what I consider to be the #1 project ever done by anybody in three principles, and that was Modello. And that was highlighted. I was in Florida for them, and there was all these professionals, but these women were way more impactful, way more energetic. And they had the African American and Hispanic mostly. And so Roger brought a diverse crowd and a poor crowd into the three principles. And that a lot of that has disappeared, to me, sadly, to be honest. And but Modello was the crowning project. Sid loved Modello, and he loved what Roger had done within that. And then, of course, we have our famous guest, Jack Pransky, so famous. And you're supposed to smile, Jack, but you didn't. Okay. And he wrote a book, many books. He's been very good on the history of it. And he wrote a book on Modello. And perhaps you start wherever you want, Jack, and what you have seen, but that is just a little bit of an intro.
Well, thank you, Harry. I'll start by what I realized yesterday. What I realized yesterday was that I was working in the alcohol and drug field in the state of Vermont at the moment that I bumped into Roger Mills and ultimately the Modello project. And so I was reflecting on what it was that we used to do in the alcohol and drug field when I was involved with it. And they were basically 4 things that we would do, maybe 5. So we would provide information about alcohol and drugs. We would teach skills. We would build supports, and we would create conditions in the family, the school, the peer group, and the rest of the community that would ultimately build what we called healthy self-perceptions. And this comes from Dr. Stephen Glenn, that people really needed to feel like they were capable, important, and powerful. Now, those are the things that come from within oneself, but we thought they came from how the environment was structured to be able to build those things. So we would teach people how to structure the environment so that those healthy self-perceptions would be built. And so I bump into Roger Mills serendipitously because I just went to a conference in Burlington, Vermont, and he was the main speaker there. And he brought with him a couple of women from the housing projects. And one of them was a severe alcoholic who was being severely beaten by her boyfriend on crack. And in turn, she was beating her kids. And I could tell from listening to her that she had not only kicked alcohol without going into treatment, without going into AA, but that she was living a happy life. And her life was in the depths of despair at that time, you know, right before that. And I could not believe this was happening. I couldn't wrap my head around what had happened to her, because you could tell from listening to her that she would never go back. Like there wasn't even a question, she would never go back. And so I got curious. I was writing a book at the time about the field of prevention. I asked Roger Mills if I could squeeze in something about this project. He said yes, and then I pretty much forgot about it. I just chalked it up to one of the best prevention programs I had ever heard. And then I was reading this other book, I think it was called Teacher, about this principal who had come into a really terrible school situation in southern New Hampshire. And it was the story of how he came in and turned around this entire school system. And it was written like a novel, except it wasn't a novel because it was true. And so it just came to me, okay, I have to write a book about what happened in the Modello housing project, like this book was written about him coming into a school system. And so I asked Roger if I could go down and interview the people and write this book. And he said yes. And then Hurricane Andrew came by just as I was about to go down there. And I decided to wait. And by the time I got down there, a month later, the entire housing project had been blown apart, literally. And there were people who the government had set up, like catty-cornered across the street, a makeshift trailer park. Half the Modello residents had gone into gone into this park. The other half had gone to their relatives or whoever they could go with. They brought in new people into this trailer park. So by the time I got there, you couldn't really tell what had happened to Modello anymore. And but one thing that was very, very consistent was the lives of the people whose lives had been touched the most. They were still around and available. And so I had the privilege of interviewing them. And I was even more impressed about how these people's lives had just completely turned around. And they were the one, people's lives were in the depths of despair in terms of after the hurricane went through, because it was a horrible, horrible hurricane. And what they were the ones who were out helping other people. And their lives were, under the circumstances, doing okay. And much better, even after the hurricane went through, doing much better than before they encountered Roger Mills and his staff.
And it was documented as the worst ghetto in the United States, which is saying something quite a bit.
Well, I don't know that it was that, but it was bad. It was bad. It was a place that the police didn't even want to come in there to, you know, respond to a request, a problem, because they would get rocked and bottled, and you know, it was a terrible place. They couldn't get pizza delivered there. They couldn't get a taxi cab to come in because the place was so violent.
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me was, so Roger Mills goes in there and he basically says, without using these words, he says, "This is the place for me." You know, you know, you just couldn't imagine walking into a more difficult kind of situation than that. And I don't know whether he was extremely brave or just completely oblivious to any of the dangers that were around there. But it was really an amazing thing, what he did.
And what one of these strange things, Roger was very distinguished. He'd go in with a suit, a jacket and tie, very white, waspy guy. This is really the heart of Africa and American Hispanic conflict and stuff. And he was just persistent. And when he found there was one tough lady, big lady, and she just grabbed the people and brought them in. And all of a sudden, he was teaching not only to the people, but to the school system, to the police force, to all the stuff around. He was very, very inclusive.
Well, he had been trained as a community organizer before all of this. And he kind of combined the two in a way, except now he would be working from the inside out instead of the outside in. Community organizing from the outside in is you kind of sow the seeds of discontent, you know, and you say, you know, you're living in these horrible conditions here. You need to get together to change the conditions. And that may be true, but what Roger came in saying was, if people's thinking doesn't change, they're still going to be committing all of the acts that people commit that we try to prevent. And if people don't recognize that they've got this beautiful, perfect place inside themselves that can never get touched, can never get damaged, no matter what circumstances and situations they live in. You know, if you don't feel like that is there, which most people don't, there's really no hope. And when there's no hope, you don't care. You know, you don't really care what happens. People can go down the tubes very, very easily that way.
And so we have the people who felt totally hopeless, and then all of a sudden they experienced, it wasn't three principles then, let's say it was truth as uncovered by Sydney Banks. And all of a sudden they not only had hope, but they were going out into other communities and teaching. They were professionals. Or by the time they arrived in Florida talking, you weren't looking at a hopeless group of people. You were looking at the most inspiring people in the universe.
Yeah. And, you know, I just want to make sure that everybody's clear. It was still all about the three principles, even though it wasn't called the three principles then. You know, they didn't go in talking the three principles, mind, consciousness, and thought. But they would, one of the beautiful things about Roger was he understood that you have to start where people are at. And what could people relate to? So for example, he had, you know, he did a little survey. He had that woman you were talking about, you know, do the survey that was basically asking people what they cared most about in their community and what their concerns mostly were. So he would, you know, so they would say, well, you know, we're having trouble with our kids. So that led to him establishing a, what they called a parenting class. But it wasn't a traditional parenting class where you would bring in some kind of parenting curriculum and go through it. It was just sitting around talking about what was going on with their kids and helping them see from the inside out. And, you know, they said, we're having trouble with the school. And so they established a, you know, parent teacher organization, which was basically the same thing as the parenting class. It was just a different, they called it one thing one time and another thing the other time. The same people showed up for both. And, you know, during that particular class, things came out like Roger would introduce this concept of moods, you know, and like when you're in a low mood, everything's going to look bad. The same exact thing can happen to you. And if you're in a high mood, things don't look so bad. But when you're in a low mood, things look terrible. And your thinking is totally messed up when you're in a low mood. And so you can't trust your thinking at those times. And so people at first they you know made fun of him, and they tried to you know, they told him he was crazy and all of that stuff. But some of you may have heard this story, and it's certainly in the Modello book. But so one day, this woman named Linda, I think I called her Carrie Mae in the book. She had a violent temper. She was a very nice person, but had a violent temper, especially when it came to her kid, and especially when it came to her kid acting out in school. So she was known to grab her belt, storm down to the school, and wail away on the rail away on him in front of the principal. And, you know, it was just a horrible situation. So one day after she goes through the parenting class or is involved in it, she gets called by the school system, and the school says, your kid just pulled a knife on somebody at school. And we're talking about a kid who's 10 years old, something like that. So she gets livid. She grabs her belt, storms down to the school, and halfway there, something clicks in her mind. She says, uh-oh, I'm in a low mood right now. I'd better watch it. So she goes over to the school, doesn't say anything, picks her kid up, brings him home, puts him in his room, goes to a neighbor's house, and stays there for 3 hours until she felt this love come back for her child again. And then she goes to him and she says, honey, or whatever term of endearment she used, you know, what could have been on your mind to make you pull a knife on somebody at school? And he is absolutely shocked because he's just used to getting wailed on. And he said to her, oh, you know, I was really scared because these kids were picking on me and I didn't know what to do. And then she realized that she never even gave him a chance to talk before. She would always just land on him with both feet. And in that moment, she saw through this love for him. And she broke down, and they both broke down together, and their relationship was never the same after that. All just by a simple little understanding about moods. And suddenly they were existing on a higher plane from that point on. So that's a story that illustrates the kind of thing that went on, that people got these incredible insights that just shifted them.
And the expression of the women to Roger was also amazing. Rogers had an understanding that when he was talking with them, they were the energy. He was actually, he's a good presenter, but he's rather low-keyed. But so he would pass the torch over to them because he knew they had the fresh insights that would inspire whoever was listening. But
That's
they
right.
couldn't stop talking about how much they loved Roger. You know, I mean, impersonally, they just were so appreciative of what had happened and the momentum of that community. It wasn't just one or two or three or four or five. It was a whole community.
But at first, everybody's got to understand that they thought he was crazy at the beginning. They tried to do everything in their power to get him out of there. And he was so consistently there that he would just not go away. And he would drive them crazy by the fact that he wouldn't go away. They were trying to get him out and he would not go away. And that showed them something. Because usually when they try to get somebody to go away, they go away because it's not that pleasant, you know. So.
And the other thing to notice is, although Roger was a master at getting grants, on the nonprofit, you're not, these communities don't have money, so you have to get money from the government. But on this particular project, which was the cornerstone of his whole career exploding, there was very little money there. It was enough, very little. It was a very small grant, and he went into it. He needed something at that point in his life. He had had a little bit of disruption, and he needed something, and that showed up. And it wasn't like, it was the opposite of what we can consider good business sense, but it turned out to be good business sense.
I think his first grant was he was able to hire himself 1/4 time and hire 2 staff people who he trained or got trained half-time at first. And then eventually he was able to work there half-time, and then they were able to get up to full-time. And then he was able to hire a couple of more people.
Yeah. So does anyone have any question about Modello before we move on a little bit from that?
Yeah, please ask questions. I love questions.
Morning. Hi,
Good
everyone.
morning.
I'm just, I was sitting here thinking how amazing it could be if some of those women in that community were revisited, or I don't know if any of them are still in touch with people in the Three Principles community in terms of teaching. But yeah, wouldn't it be amazing to kind of revisit some of that?
Somebody did have that idea last year. And so there was a little flurry of activity, you know, to try to get to actually, you know, wanting to do like a documentary or something, and interview the people now and kind of juxtapose it with, you know, footage from back then. And which I thought was a great idea, but I did not have the, I mean, I'm about ready to retire, so I didn't want to do it myself, but we contacted the person who worked alongside Roger, and that person was going to go and contact the women, but and then nothing seemed to happen from it. However, 3 days ago, I got the most amazing email from out of the blue from the daughter of the woman who, her name was Rita, but I called her Lisa in the book. And she told me what her life had been like growing up with someone who understood the principles, and how Rita's life had just been like blossomed ever since that time. I was very, very touched. I mean, this really only happened 3 days ago that I heard this, and it was from out of nowhere. And yeah, I was really grateful to her for telling me this, because otherwise, how would you know? You know?
What a beautiful retirement gift.
Yes, that's true. Absolutely true. Yeah.
And they, like everybody, when they were together, there was that energy, like Salt Spring. But like Salt Spring, then everybody went in their own direction. And some just went into living a much healthier, happy life. One gal, Cynthia Steves, I think, Stennis, that's, sorry, excuse me. She went out, and she went out and taught in different communities and so on. So each took what was best for them and evolved into it. But Jack's story is very touching because it showed a person who felt hopeless, and one of the angriest women and toughest women you're ever going to meet, and turned into, well, what has happened to us, you know.
Yeah, if there was ever any question about whether people could find hope in what appeared to be a hopeless situation, they are the living proof. And it showed me that it's possible for anybody.
And it inspired me to realize that I could go work with the indigenous people and maybe be lucky enough to create that. It became a dream, a vision for me of going into, well, if Roger can do it there, why can't I do it here?
Right, and after Roger had the success in Modello that he did, he then started it in other communities, and it didn't. There were a couple hit and misses, and then Coliseum Gardens in Oakland, California. It was another place. That was the one that was called the murder capital of the world, and you know, they had tremendous success there too. And I want to put in a plug, not because it's my book, but my most recent book was a book called Hope for All, which is these incredible interviews that were done a long time ago from people who were in Coliseum Gardens and in other housing projects, and then when they had their lives completely change as a result, then they went out and helped other people's lives change. Very, very inspiring interviews. Really incredible.
And when Roger went to the Coliseum, I forget the name of what you just said, he also, because he had the reputation and credentials, Elsie joined him for a period of time, and she worked there, and she piggybacked on his credentials, and he piggybacked on her level of consciousness. It was very beautiful arrangement.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure whether she was in Coliseum Gardens, but she was definitely in other housing projects around there, and
yeah, Brooklyn and so on.
She's great.
Yeah, and so evolves. There's a word Greg uses that I love, organic. It grew organically or spiritually, which as Jack will attest is always a little unusual. And
So speaking of Greg, so Greg was having some technical difficulties before, but I just want, Greg, I just want you to know that you should feel free to jump in anytime you want here.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, my laptop still isn't working, right? It's actually updating. So I joined on my tablet. But yeah, I don't know, it's a beautiful thing when communities come together. And that's really what this world needs, is for people to come together. We have the ability to be more connected than any generation in history. And yet we're the most disconnected people in existence in history. I mean, I'm constantly, I can't even think of the right word, but just, it hurts my heart to see how disconnected people are. Mm-hmm. And the fact that people are so afraid of trying to connect with each other. You know, and just this huge misunderstanding of, you know, how we experience life. And then we have all of these laws and stuff that come up with, you know, for all the politically correct stuff. And then people are even more afraid to talk to each other because I might offend you. And not only not only the fact that I might offend you, but then I may be labeled as something. You know, I'm a bigot because I made some, you know, it wasn't even it had nothing to do. Somebody became offended by something I said because they took it a different way, not realizing that their experience of life isn't coming from what I said. Mm-hmm. You know, and it would be such an amazing thing to see, like, what happened in these communities we've been talking about, to see that starting to happen everywhere. It would just be such a wonderful thing to see that. And I you know, I try to, as much as possible, just kind of spread that love where I'm at. And that's what each of us needs to do. You know, we don't all need to become coaches and whatnot. You know, like Sid said, go live your life. You know, be that beacon of light for other people who you happen to come across in your life.
Yeah, that's so true. And at the same time, there can be organizational efforts in housing projects, other communities, you know, and that Harry said at the beginning that there is far less of that going on now than there used to be at the beginning, because Roger himself, he saw himself as being of service. And Sid saw himself as being of service. And it is that being of service that allows for the thought to go into communities like this and make change. Because you certainly don't make a lot of money on community projects like that. And so there are community projects that are going on in the world. I was just consulting with a group in the Battersea area of London, if that's the way you pronounce it. And, you know, they're doing good work there. And there are other places where good work is being done. But the thrust of actually making change, creating change in those low-income inner city type areas is something that is less there now than it was before.
And there is some in England. I do agree, Jack. There are independent thrusts in that direction. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to be that country. The other hard part is that I found, Greg, was you know, when I taught in a recovery center, the people would love what was being shared, but then of course there was all these other approaches being taught at the same time. And so it leads to the question of when we are accepted at a certain level, perhaps we'll be able to have a 100% working with the poor type of or community project developed. And it is a dream of mine that that would happen in my lifetime anyway.
So make it happen.
It is, I am.
There you go. That's the only way for it to happen. We can all sit around and wait for someone else to do it, but
Yeah.
we each just need to be, like I said, be that beacon of light for other people in whatever capacity that is. If you don't have the time and resources to start a community project, then just be that light for the people that are in your life. You know, go to work and go through the day being that, you know, happy human being that you are. Being genuine. That's really the key, is to be genuine. Mm-hmm. You've had an experience and you have an understanding that has changed your life and can help change other people's lives. Don't be afraid to share it. Gently, but share it.
Share the feeling.
Yeah, share that love, share the feeling, share, you know, share what you found from it. It's not about sharing the words. Share the feeling.
True. Anybody else have any? Oh, yes, Bob. How you doing, Bob?
I'm doing great. Good to see you, Jack.
See you too, Bob.
I was going to say, I read your book, Hope for All, and that's spectacular. And I used that in my 3 principles group and read one of the articles in there. I think it was the 3rd one in there. And the lady just seemed like if there was ever anybody that there was no hope for, she was it. Mm-hmm. And the entire book is great and very well. I think it's 6 people, isn't it, Jack?
6 or 8 or something like that.
Yeah, and each one is a different story, but and different ways of people coming to the 3 principles and using them. But I've loaned that book out to several people, and they've really gotten a lot out of it. You can't read that and not really feel like there is hope for all. So, I mean, it's a great title and just a good book and a great reference to pass out to people and share to give them hope.
Wow, did I pay you to say that, Bob?
No, you don't need to. It's the truth.
Thank you.
It reminds me of Sid wrote two books, autobiographies that aren't published, and in the first one, it was documented up to when his wife passed away, and he continually had this experience. Someone would come, they would hear something, and they'd go away and just live a very happy life. And he kept saying, I lose all my best teachers. The only ones who stay are the ones who got problems, you know, type of thing. That's why I stayed. And, you know, but I was touched by, things would happen. He would share, the person would have an insight, and then they'd live a more beautiful life. And he thought that was perfect.
But just imagine, you know, and I've said this lately on all the webinars that I've done lately, because I just want people to understand this. Imagine this happening to just one person who starts to see life in a completely new way because he has an enlightenment experience. That's one thing. But the fact that he wanted to give it away, like it didn't occur to him to say, I wonder how much money I can make out of this now. You know, now that I've had this insight. He wanted to give it away. And it has spread one person at a time, you know. And it's, you know, who knows how many people there are now in the world who are involved with this, hundreds of thousands. And it's gonna, it can't stop it. Can't stop it. That's hope too.
And the other part of Sid was he never compromised on the purity of the principles for money. It was always about the purity of the principles, right to his deathbed.
And he was not above nailing people when he saw the purity being compromised.
That's so true. Excuse me. Just some images flashed in front of me. Yeah.
So Jack, do you think that might be where, I don't want to say gone wrong, but where maybe the sharing of the principles has kind of gotten off track a little bit, where there's a lot more people trying to make money at it nowadays,
Well,
versus just sharing it, you know?
it's tricky because even some of the people making a lot of money on it are still doing good work. You know, they're still helping people's lives. Other people have insights when they're around them. That's all very beautiful. You know, they've spread it out to more people than most. On the other hand, being of service gets lost a little bit. And that's what I personally would like to see more of. You know, and there are people who really have set their sights on being of service to others. And those are the people who I think have the most hope for spreading the message in the most pure way, myself. Just speaking for myself. As I'm about to retire, I can say things like this.
I definitely agree. There's, you know, there's nothing wrong with you know, being compensated for your time.
Absolutely, people have to make a living.
Yeah, you have to make a living. Yeah, it's just, it needs to be.
I know people have to make a killing, but you know, living is
right.
I had the unusual twist of the more I did it, gave it away and did it for free, the more money it came in through another route. And I could, oh, it's like I'm getting paid through the back door rather than the front door. And it felt actually more special because I didn't have to, if you're dealing with the poorer crowd of people, in most cases, you're quite a bit better off than they are. And they can't do that. So I could give people who are helping me the money because they desperately needed it. And for some reason, in another way, it just kept pouring in. And I went, oh, this is so cool. The more I give away, the more I get. And that's what Sid said to me. He said, I'll always have money because I share so much love. It has to come back. He says, it just works like that. And when he said that, I didn't understand it, to be honest, Jack. I didn't at that point. But now I have a sense that is true. You're going, if you give it away, it comes back. But it doesn't come back linear. It comes back more spherical, you know, and or unexplainable. And
yeah, and while you were talking, it occurred to me as something I wanted to say at the very beginning when you introduced this, Harry. I just want to make sure, since I wrote the book Paradigm Shift, which is the history of of the principles. Really, George Pransky was the first one to go up to Salt Spring Island and see Sid, but then he came back and, told Roger Mills about it. And Roger was the one who then went up there and actually lived up there for a while. And then later on, George came up and also lived up there. But I just wanted to.
Oh, to be honest, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So thank you for clarifying that.
It was hard to separate the two of them.
Yeah. They created tremendous impact on Salt Spring. Sid started talking about them, and they came in, but it was strange. Everybody who came in up to then, I always felt like I was here and they were there. Roger and George came in, and it was more like, holy, this is a whole new ball game.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very, very clean. And when you listen to the first talk at Cedar Beach called Seminar on Mental Health, where Roger and Elsie finished first at Sid, and then Roger's just in that laugh of his just takes you right into another world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any other questions or comments? I don't know how much time we have.
I don't. Well, so after Modello and Roger, George, Roger going into creating health realization, and George creating psychology of mind, and those two being majorly like when I went back.
Clarify something about that too, Harry.
Okay.
Because it wasn't really that way. I mean, what really happened is that Sid said that it should be called psychology of mind. And everybody who was, working in the realm of psychology at that time with what turned out to be the principles, went in the direction of calling it psychology of mind. It was because you couldn't go into a community and call it psychology of mind, because you wouldn't have been able to get anywhere. So that's when Roger came up with the name Health Realization, which made a tremendous amount of sense to me, because, it's this notion of everybody's got health within them and all people have to do is realize it. And so that was something that people could relate to more. But it wasn't that there was psychology of mind on one side and health realization on another, and they were kind of like going like that. It really wasn't that way. It was all psychology of mind until it became the three principles, and health realization was like I don't even want to say a branch off of it, but it was like the community aspect of it was called health realization. Now, this is not self-serving. Even though I wrote the book Paradigm Shift, which is the history of the three principles, and I highly recommend everybody read it, but the money doesn't go to me. It goes to support the Three Principles Global Community. So all proceeds from that book go to support the Three Principles Global Community. And so I highly recommend that people take a look at that, because it has all the history in it.
Well, speaking of the history, I'm going to ask another question. Now we've talked about Modello, but then Sid did a lot of, the psychologists from all over the place, like Keith and yourself and George, and came in for, how did Sid support the next layer of people? Salt Spring is now finished, only basically Elsie and Chip and a few others have moved on with where he's going with it. How did he support you guys?
The psychology of mind, well, there was a connection made to the American Psychological Association. And I'm not sure how that connection was made, but because the connection was made to the American Psychological Association, the question came up, what do they need to recognize this as a psychology? They said, you need a board, you need, so the Psychology of Mind Training Institute happened. And there was a board of people. So they hired Sid to be a consultant to them. They would meet with Sid periodically, and he would help them deepen their understanding. And, if they got too far afield, off track, he would pull them back in to the purity of what the principles we're talking about. So it was kind of like, that's the way it always went. People would get these ideas about how you could best put this out. And even though they were good ideas about how you put it out, if it lost some of the purity of the principles, Sid would have to rein it back in. And that happened like this, it happened like this, it happened like this. Sid was always having to rein it back in. And now, unfortunately, there's nobody really around to do that. And so while the beauty of it is that it's spreading far and wide, the danger is that it will lose its purity. And so there's those two things that are happening simultaneously at the same time.
So how would you define the purity of the principles?
Well, when people see it as simplicity itself, that's the purity.
Mm-hmm.
When it is so simple that it couldn't be deeper, that's the purity of the principles. And there's also, I would say, I'm kind of just making this part up, that to me, there's living the spirit of the three principles. Living the spirit of the three principles is living through the eyes of love, essentially. And being, it's kind of what Greg was talking about. Being love with first yourself and then everybody else that you bump into in life. And there are certain times we're going to be able to do that better than others because we all have blind spots. There are places where we forget the principles are always in operation and things look like reality to us. We're always going to bump into those things and we're going to forget all about the principles in those ways. But in general, living our lives through the eyes of the spirit of the principles, which is through the eyes of love. And you can feel that emanate from people. Sid always talked about the importance of the feeling. That's the feeling. The feeling is the feeling of love. Is that what's being put out to people? Is that, and if one could say, yes, I'm feeling that from other people, then you could say that those teachers who are putting that out like that, or those people putting it out like that, are putting it out through the spirit of the three principles. And if you hear a lot of people say, that's just your thinking, or something like that, you know, and it's not being done with love, and it's not being done with listening, then that's when to be suspicious. But that's my own view.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. And how does that, in your mind, apply to, say, someone who's going through a lot of suffering and addiction, and the simplicity that you alluded to?
Well, to me, in addiction, there's always and only two things going on. There's the physical hold that it has on the body. So it's physical addiction. And then there's thought. And, you know, because it's so fascinating that people can go through detox and all of the hold on the body leaves. People get out of detox, get out of treatment, and there's so much relapse. Why is there so much relapse? Thought. People haven't learned through their recovery how how our experience of life is created, moment to moment, from the inside out. So if that is juxtaposed with whatever else is being done in recovery, and people are able to see how their experience, you know, where their experience of life actually comes from, and are able to see that pure spirit from the inside, that that's what needs to be touched to lift people out. That to me is living the spirit of the principles with people who have addiction issues. Did I answer your question? I wasn't
Perfect. Oh yeah, 100%, Jack. That was
Okay,
dead
that's
on. I just loved it. Yeah, no, it was absolutely answered the question. So, yeah, and very simply, which, as you alluded to, is very beautiful.
simpler.
Sid, that's what Sid said. He always said that. And of course, I had trouble
None
with,
of us knew what he was talking about at the time, but
yeah, exactly. What do you mean simpler the better? Yeah, exactly.
yeah, we couldn't fathom a word he was talking about, and he said it was so simple. You know?
Yeah.
But the fact of the three principles, once that was, once Sid realized that that's what he was talking about, these three simple principles, that's what made everything else come together. Because he was always talking the three principles, but he was always like all over the place, you could say. It was hard to really grasp what he was talking about. But once the three principles came into being, not that they weren't always in being, don't get me wrong, but once you realized that that's all that it was, that's all that happens every single time, there's just the energy behind life that has all possibilities built into it, and the purest part of oneself. And then all we can do is create the illusion that we're thinking ourselves away from it. I mean, it's so simple. We're everything that we're looking for already, and we just think ourselves away from it, but you can never really get away from it, so it's just an illusion.
A beautiful illusion.
Yeah.
Or
Some of them don't feel so, some of the illusions don't feel so beautiful. Like the addiction illusion does not feel so beautiful.
But in the evolution of perfection of life, it turns out that it is.
Yeah.
And that's what I love. I made no mistakes, although it did appear that I made a lot of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was perfect for me.
Just had learning opportunities.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Might as well enjoy them, guys. That's all they are. And to deepen your appreciation for being mentored by mind, just to use a phrase by Elsie. So, or what I would say, when Jack would say, mentored by spirit.
Okay.
It looks like this is where we've come to, and since you didn't do the introduction, Greg, you might as well do the conclusion. Yeah. Go ahead, Greg.
Are you recording this then, Harry? Was that you?
Annette is recording.
Annette?
Somehow Annette became the host when you left.
Oh, nice. I was wondering about that.
Yeah, we'll have to figure that out a little better. Okay, but Annette, can you send me the audio and video file? That'd be really great, and also to Greg as well, please.
Yeah, I will try to do that. I did fall out at one point, but then I came back on, so there might be a little.
Okay, it's okay. Probably was a boring moment anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
Those never happen.
So wrap it up, Greg.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us today, and especially Jack for your pre-retirement addition to our ongoing conversation here. It's always great to have you on, Jack. I like the simplicity that you keep in the principles, and I agree with you that there's a lot of complications being added, and it's nice to hear somebody just keeps things basic and simple, because that's really how people are going to get this. When we overcomplicate it, it gets the intellect involved, and that's just bad news.
It took me a long time to come to it, though. I really had to see the simplicity for myself. I spent many years seeing the complexity. So there's hope for all of you yet.
And that's true,
awesome.
Jack. What I've seen of you, you have risen as the years have gone on, and actually gained momentum, and that's a tribute to